We often assume that legends, those who change the whole world with their voices and talent, when they depart must be surrounded by an aura of glory, or at least a final dignity worthy of their stature. But the truth is sometimes starker and more bitter than any dramatic Hollywood screenplay. Death, at times, holds no favor for geniuses. Would you believe it? There were men who stood on the world's most dazzling stages, yet collapsed forever on a dusty sidewalk simply because of a crude air conditioner, a cheap plastic lighter, or even because of a piece of someone else's forgotten lingerie. Today, we will turn back the bloody and absurd pages of history regarding 13 famous black figures with the most ridiculous and tragic deaths ever recorded. These stem from negligence so silly it is laughable, from foolish pranks in the heat of the moment, or from the cold indifference that humans still reserve for one another in the shadows of prejudice. Join me in finding the answer behind these laughable yet tear-filled endings. To see that, between the peak of fame and the abyss of nothingness, there is sometimes only a single moment of carelessness, a moment that perhaps even you or I have unknowingly walked past in our own lives. 1. Harry Womack, a wrongful death from forgotten lingerie and a death sentence for the wrong man. It was a March evening in 1974 in Los Angeles when Harry Womack, a member of the Valentinos and the younger brother of the legendary Bobby Womack, met his end in a manner no one could have possibly imagined. It was not a gangland execution, nor was it the consequence of substance abuse so common in the artist circles of that era. Harry died right where he should have felt safest, inside his own apartment, all because of a forgotten piece of women's lingerie. The incident began when Harry returned home after a long day. Waiting for him there was Patricia, his girlfriend, seething in a fit of extreme jealousy after discovering a strange pair of lace panties in the room. In a showbiz world rife with betrayal, Patricia had no patience left to hear any explanations. A fiery argument erupted within the walls of that cramped apartment. In a climax of lost control, Patricia grabbed a kitchen knife and plunged it straight into Harry's chest. That blow pierced through his shirt, through his unfinished musical plans, and ended the life of the man often known by the nickname Harry Hippie. But the naked truth behind that object is what leaves one aghast at the senselessness of this death. According to later confessions by Bobby Womack himself, that fateful pair of panties had absolutely nothing to do with Harry. They belonged to Bobby's girlfriend. A few days prior, Bobby and his girlfriend had stopped by the apartment, and in the chaotic carelessness of prolonged partying, the woman had left her personal item behind on the sofa or wedged in the cushions. Harry, the younger brother who always lived in his sibling's shadow, ultimately took the knife for a sin he never committed. Harry Womack's death stands as a cold reminder of the dark side of the debauchery within the Hollywood artist circle of the 70s. The carelessness of the older brother and the blind rage of a woman created a tragedy where the victim was the most innocent one of all. Later, when the song Harry Hippie became famous, people often sang along to its free-spirited melody, forgetting that behind it lies a forensic file of a man who died a grievous death due to a ridiculous mix-up. Mary, be careful of what you do, 'cause the life you lead, it's gonna come back to you. In the context of the unveiled truth, that lyric is no longer just aimless advice. It resembles a bitter indictment. The loose lifestyle and the lack of responsibility for the smallest details in the older brother's private life truly came back to haunt their family. Yet the one who paid the price with his life was Harry.
Ladies and gentlemen, is there any death more bitter than paying the ultimate price solely because of the negligence of a loved one?
And we must ask ourselves, is our own complacent lifestyle unwittingly digging a grave for the ones we hold most dear?
2. Little Walter, the legendary blues harp, silenced by a petty brawl and a fateful sleep. If there was one man who completely revolutionized the face of the blues with a tiny harmonica, it was Little Walter. During the golden years in Chicago, he was the uncrowned king of chess records, the man who transformed a humble folk instrument into a powerful musical weapon. However, that artistic stature stood in stark contrast to the total lack of control in his personal life. In February 1968, the music world lost this genius not to a terminal illness or a shocking assassination, but to his own fiery temper and a cheap street brawl. Little Walter was notorious for a reckless lifestyle, heavy drinking, and a hothead always ready to explode at the slightest provocation. That night, during an intermission at a performance in Chicago, instead of resting to continue his work, Walter got entangled in a petty gambling dispute right on the sidewalk outside the club. In the world of low-rent entertainment joints of that era, scuffles between players were a daily occurrence, but this time, the consequences went far beyond any calculation. Walter took a fatal blow to the head. At the age of 37, with the complacency of a man all too familiar with physical altercations, he dismissed it as a minor injury and refused all medical attention. Instead of going to a hospital to check the head trauma, Walter chose to go to his girlfriend's apartment on South Bennett Avenue and go to sleep, hoping the pain would vanish after a long rest. But he never woke up again. Inside his skull, a blood clot had formed and silently traveled, leading to coronary thrombosis, a direct consequence of the blow from the earlier fight. The next morning, he was found motionless in bed. The king of the harmonica had departed in silence, right in the middle of his sleep, while his musical plans remained unfinished. The death of little Walter was a horrific waste of talent, exposing the dark underbelly of the street life that many black artists of that time were trapped in. He had survived thousands of dazzling performances, overcame the harsh prejudices of society, only to fall because of a dispute not worth a single dime on the street. People still listen to his hit Juke with admiration, but few realize that the hands that created that music history were the same hands that clenched to plunge into a meaningless fight, leading to a tragic end in a bed that wasn't even his own. To this day, when looking back at the documentary footage of chess records, the heartbreak is palpable for a genius with fiery eyes, but a soul that was far too unstable. Walter died without a single last word. Only the sound of his harmonica seems to still linger in the cold Chicago wind as a reminder of impermanence. Fame can turn a man into a giant on stage, but complacency and petty rage can strike them down to the cold, hard ground at any moment. 3. Roger Troutman. A funk anthem, cut short by the fury of kinship. If there was a single sound that defined the electric pulse of 90s West Coast hip-hop, it was the signature robotic talkbox of Roger Troutman. From the classic grooves of the group, Zap, to the super hit California Love with Tupac Shakur, Roger was a brilliant musical architect who breathed a modern, mesmerizing life into funk. Yet, behind those radiant melodies that made the whole world dance lay a bloody family tragedy, a brutal conclusion that no fan could have ever foreseen. On that fateful morning of April 25, 1999 in Dayton, Ohio, the truth about the Troutman empire was exposed in the most painful way possible. Roger Troutman was found slumped outside his recording studio, his body riddled with bullet wounds. Despite being rushed to emergency care, the King of Funk could not survive on the operating table. Just hours later, not far from the crime scene, authorities discovered the body of Larry Troutman, Roger's own brother and longtime manager, dead in a car from a self-inflicted gunshot wound to the head. Police quickly concluded this was a murder-suicide where the perpetrator and the victim were brothers sharing the same blood and the same musical dream. The motive behind this shooting did not lie in the glitzy conflicts of the entertainment world, but in the collapse of trust and the crushing weight of financial burdens. Larry Troutman, once the pillar managing the family business, was facing the implosion of their shared company and bitter monetary disputes with his own brother. In the world of the Troutman brothers, the line between family and business had been erased by mounting debt and resentment accumulated over years. The older brother, who once guided his sibling to the pinnacle of fame, now chose to end it all with the barrel of a gun, turning the studio, which should have been a sanctuary of creativity, into a cold crime scene. The tragic death of this legendary artist is a horrifying slice of reality regarding the state of many performing families, where money and poor management can transform the closest of loved ones into sworn enemies.
And so, in the end, we are left to ask ourselves, after all is said and done, is money truly worth the price of turning kin into enemies?
And ultimately, when will we finally cease destroying our own homes for the sake of hollow, fleeting vanity?
4. James Booker, the unfinished sonata in a hospital wheelchair. In a music world teeming with vibrant, powerful personalities, James Booker emerged as the most solitary and distinct entity. Hailed as the Black Liberace of New Orleans, he was a piano sorcerer of supreme technique, one who could make the keys dance between jazz, blues, and classical in an unimaginable way. An openly gay black man, wearing a glittering star-studded eye patch and bearing tormenting addictions. Booker was a symbol of eccentricity and innate talent.
Yet the truth surrounding his death stands as a stark indictment of human indifference and the collapse of the public health system.
On an afternoon in November 1983, James Booker was rushed to Charity Hospital in New Orleans in a state of severe physical collapse. This was no plush hotel or private clinic reserved for the Hollywood elite. It was a public hospital for the city's most destitute souls. Here, the title of piano genius held no weight against a medical chart scarred by years of drug abuse and alcoholism. To the medical staff on duty that day, Booker was no musical legend. He was just another impoverished black addict, one of thousands processed with weary indifference and prejudice. Instead of being rushed into the emergency room to fight for his life, James Booker was left abandoned in a battered wheelchair in the middle of a stifling, overcrowded waiting room. He sat there, head slumped amidst the cacophony of patients and the sharp stench of antiseptic, waiting for help that was already too late. Not a single soul realized that the man gasping for air in that wheelchair was the Bayou Maharaja, the very man who had once stunned the world's grandest stages. Booker drew his final breath right there in that seat, in absolute solitude amidst the crowd, before a single doctor could even lay a hand on his pulse. The truth regarding James Booker's death was more than just a botched emergency procedure. It laid bare a ruthless, unwritten law of American society in the 80s. Once the stage lights fade, a human being's worth is measured solely by their appearance and the scars of their past. To the healthcare system of that era, a black man, gay, reeking of alcohol and drugs, held no right to priority, even if those very hands had once touched the heavens upon the piano keys. That night, the title of Black Liberace, or the adoration of New Orleans aristocrats, evaporated completely against the peeling, decay-ridden walls of Charity Hospital. James Booker was cast into a vortex of silent discrimination, a place where men like him were viewed as burdens rather than patients. Leaving him to let his breath fade away in a wheelchair in the middle of that waiting room was no accident, but the result of a systemic indifference reserved for lives branded as dregs. They allowed a genius to die like a nobody, not because they couldn't save him, but because they felt he wasn't worth the rush. His passing was a silent scream of injustice, a raw truth that glamorous New Orleans often tries to hide behind cheerful jazz rhythms. James Booker didn't die for his music. He died because of poverty and because the label of addict completely overshadowed the value of his life. The final memory of him isn't the showman on stage with his glittering star-shaped eye patch. It is a thin, lonely body slumped amidst the smell of hospital chemicals and the spine-chilling indifference of the world. 5. Don Mrick, a saxophone. Solo silenced forever by a deadly mistake involving a lighter. In the annals of funk and soul, Don Mrick is a name synonymous with saxophone melodies that became legend. As the very soul of the illustrious Phoenix Horns, he helped forge the brilliance of earth, wind and fire, and left an indelible mark with that haunting solo in Phil Collins' hit, One More Night. But all that glory was brutally extinguished on a summer morning in 1993 in Los Angeles. Not by the cruel passage of time, but by a deadly mistake at the hands of law enforcement. The events unfolded like a scene from a bad crime thriller. The Los Angeles Police Department stormed Don Mrick's apartment in the Palms District to execute a search warrant regarding suspected drug possession. Amidst the dim, early morning shadows of his home, Don Mrick held a butane lighter in his hand, the long-barreled kind typically used for lighting candles or gas stoves. In the chaotic moment when officers kicked down the door, Mrick instinctively raised the lighter to illuminate the faces of the strangers invading his home. But in the tension-filled, prejudiced eyes of Officer Gary, that mundane household item transformed into the black barrel of a criminal's gun. A single deafening shot tore through the silence. Don Mrick collapsed on his own floor, blood soaking his nightclothes while his hand still clutched the evidence. It is a bitter irony that an artist who spent his life cradling a golden saxophone, using his breath to soothe the souls of millions, ended his life because of a cheap plastic butane lighter worth less than $2. The police force had stormed in with guns drawn, yet ultimately seized no bricks of narcotics, nor achieved any glorious victory. The only thing they confiscated was the life of one of the greatest musicians of his generation. This death was not just a tragedy, but a supreme absurdity of fate. A place where the boundary between a mundane household tool and a lethal weapon was as thin as the baseless panic of those sworn to uphold the law. A black legend died due to a mix-up so foolish it is laughable, yet it led to a catastrophic end beyond all imagination. The saga of Don Mrick did not conclude with a prestigious award, but with a drawn-out lawsuit between his family and the city of Los Angeles. Although the city eventually paid a multi-million-dollar settlement, money could never be enough to fill the void left by that saxophone. The naked truth here is this: in the shadows of a raid, artistic status or global fame cannot protect a black man from the barrel of a police gun when suspicion overrides reason. Listen again to the lyrics Phil Collins sang in the hit One More Night, where Don Mrick delivered those fateful solo notes. Like a river to the ocean, I will always keep coming back to you. In the stark reality of that night's shooting, this line carries a suffocatingly bitter aftertaste. The artist was truly in his own home, where he belonged, but he never had the chance to come back to music or to his loved ones ever again. When Don's horn plays in the haunting solo of that song, one no longer sees just romance, but the ghost of a cruel reality, where the life of a black genius can be snatched away by a mistaken reflex in the dark. It is not just a painful scar on Hollywood showbiz, but proof that a great life can be wiped out forever in a split second, by the most mundane of household items. 6. Johnny Ace, a fateful shot on Christmas Eve and the cruel joke of the Prince of R&B. On the night of Christmas Eve 1954, while millions of fans were intoxicated by the smooth melodies of Pledging My Love, a shocking tragedy struck backstage at the City Auditorium in Houston, Texas. Johnny Ace, the man crowned the Prince of R&B, with a dashing look and a voice that could melt any maiden's heart, ended his life at the age of 25. His departure did not come from an enemy or a car accident, but from a foolish prank with a pistol, right when the intoxication of fame was at its most potent. The backstage atmosphere that night should have been overflowing with the joy of a dazzlingly successful performance. Amidst the laughter and the smell of cheap whiskey, Johnny Ace pulled out a .22 caliber revolver. This was not an act of threat, but a dangerous habit of artists of that era, treating weapons like toys to prove their mettle. Before the worried eyes of friends and colleagues, including the blues queen Big Mama Thornton, Johnny casually spun the cylinder. He laughed as he raised the barrel to his temple, mumbling a phrase that would become the most haunting last words in rock and roll history. "It's okay, gun's not loaded. See?" However, the reaper holds no regard for halos or arrogant lies, but simply waits in silence to collect the debt of life from one who likes to toy with his luck. Inside the cylinder that Johnny was convinced was a harmless void, a single bullet still lay in wait, like a cobra hiding beneath dry leaves, just waiting for a moment of vulnerability to deliver a fatal strike. A dry crack rang out, tearing through the stifling air of the dressing room and completely extinguishing the light in the young artist's eyes. Johnny Ace collapsed onto the cold floor like a puppet with cut strings, lying sprawled amidst glittering performance costumes and the scent of cheap backstage powder, turning the Christmas party into a crime scene reeking of blood. Absolute shock was etched on the faces of friends who had just been raising a glass with him, for they had just witnessed a genius single-handedly end his own era with a reckless act not worth a dime. That death was stark and stupid to the point of being laughable. A star holding the world in his hands chose to bet it all on an empty chamber, only to receive a permanent, irretrievable ending before the laughter could even fade from his lips. 7. Shorty Long, an unfinished symphony. Beneath the Detroit River.
Ladies and gentlemen, let me ask you this. Which death is more terrifying? A departure foretold by illness?
Or a sudden end from? A moment of carelessness?
In the glittering Motown family of the 1960s, Shorty Long was a multifaceted gem who could not be confused with anyone else. He was not only a singer and songwriter, but also a producer and instrumentalist who could play with virtuosity from the piano to the harmonica. With hits like Here Comes the Judge, Shorty Long was on the verge of becoming a major icon of soul music. But then, that brilliant career was submerged, in the literal sense, on a June evening in 1969, not by sinister plots or the fading of fame, but by a clumsy and pathetic maritime negligence. On that fateful night, Shorty Long and a friend were drifting leisurely on a small boat along the Detroit River. Under the dim moonlight of the Motor City, it should have been a relaxing cruise after stressful hours at the studio. Yet, in a moment of lack of observation, or perhaps due to excessive complacency before the vastness of the water, his small boat veered into the path of a massive freighter. The collision occurred like a ruthless law of physics. The small boat shattered like a plastic toy under the 1,000-ton pressure of the great ship. Shorty Long was thrown into the cold water, never to rise and breathe the air of Detroit again. This death was so stark and senseless that it left those who remained in shock. A musical genius, capable of controlling the most complex melodies, could not control a small boat to avoid an obvious disaster. He did not die of illness, nor of showbiz purges. He died simply because of an elementary mistake while out having fun, a type of ending often seen in amateurs rather than a star holding the future of Motown. The truth of Shorty Long's departure is like a song at its climax when the string suddenly snaps, leaving a silence full of disappointment and absurdity. This death was so stark and senseless that it left the living aghast. A musical genius did not die from a wasting disease, nor was he a victim of bloody purges in the shadows of showbiz, but merely because of an elementary error, a laughable carelessness while enjoying a leisurely ride. It was a pathetic ending typically seen in impulsive amateur drivers rather than in a star holding the key to the future of the Motown empire.
The truth regarding Shorty Long's departure is akin to a musical composition at its most brilliant crescendo that suddenly snaps a string.
One finds no grandeur within the debris of the wooden boat shattered beneath the hull of a giant freighter, only a price far too high for a single moment of subjectivity on the water. 8. Frankie Lyman, the shocking overdose on a rotting bathroom floor and the cruel cycle of a teen idol. Frankie Lyman was once the face representing the most radiant innocence of American music in the 1950s. With the hit Why Do Fools Fall in Love, the 13-year-old boy with the soaring voice and beaming smile became the first black teen idol, compelling the whole world to tip its hat. But that blazing halo was merely the beginning of a long descent straight into the abyss. In February 1968, the world was shocked to learn that Frankie had passed away at the age of 25. The truth of his death bore not a single trace of red carpets or stage lights, but was stark to the point of haunting. Right on the cold bathroom floor of his grandmother's small house on an old street in Harlem. Frankie Lyman's life resembled a ruthless loop of fate. After traveling around the world, tasting enough of the sweetness of fame and the bitterness of rejection, he returned to the very place he was born to draw his final breath. The irony, laughable in its cruelty, is that this death struck at the exact moment Frankie had just signed a new recording contract, a golden opportunity to rebuild his life and shake off his past of addiction. But instead of celebrating with a recording for the ages, Frankie chose to celebrate with a dose of heroin, something he believed would give him one final flight before starting his new journey. The truth of the crime scene is a hauntingly contrasting image. A genius who once stood atop the world, now lying crumpled on a dilapidated bathroom floor beside a drained syringe. Frankie died of an overdose, a death so pathetic and solitary that no one knew until his body had begun to turn cold. He did not die from a conspiracy, nor from work pressure. He died from his own weakness before the demon named drugs, right in the place where he should have felt safest. Frankie died of an overdose, a death so wretched and lonely that no one knew until his body had grown cold. He did not die from a plot to harm him, nor from the pressure of labor, but died because of his own frailty before the monster of narcotics, right in the place where he should have found peace. This death is a steely testament to the cruelty of the entertainment industry, where children are squeezed dry of talent and then discarded when their voices change. But more than that, it is a script stupid to the extreme. A man who had just touched the final life raft of his life, only to puncture it with his own hands in exchange for a few fleeting moments of a high. Frankie Lyman did not sacrifice himself for art. He collapsed because of a wrong choice right at the starting line of a new life. It is hard to hold back one's heart when reviewing old footage, looking at the boy Frankie with shining eyes and a voice as clear as an angel, then suddenly having to face the grim reality that that child grew up only to walk into a trap with no exit. 9. King Curtis, the fiery saxophone extinguished beside an air conditioner and a senseless quarrel.
Ladies and gentlemen, have you ever asked yourselves, could a mundane household item,
Something as ordinary as an air conditioner, lead to the tragic, violent death of a legend?
In the realm of soul and R&B, King Curtis's saxophone was the very soul that breathed fierce life into Aretha Franklin's anthem Respect and countless other classic melodies of the era. With hands that could make cold metal weep or laugh, King Curtis stood at the pinnacle of American music. Yet, on an August night in 1971, the glorious career of the King of the Saxophone was brutally severed. The final breath of this monarch did not fade away in a luxurious ballad, but was stolen by a script so mundane it was humiliating. A cheap shouting match over a walkway with two addicts right on his own doorstep. That night, New York was suffering through a sweltering heat wave, the kind of suffocating heat that makes tempers short and the air heavy. King Curtis was returning home, struggling under the weight of an air conditioner he was carrying, hoping to find a little cool relief in his apartment. However, right at the entrance, he encountered two addicts loitering there, blocking the path of a man exhausted by work and the heat. A fiery argument erupted simply over words exchanged about standing in the right place. At the climax of the anger, one of the two pulled a knife and stabbed it straight into the legend's chest. It is hard to imagine a truth more stark than this. A man who had traveled the world's greatest stages, a man named King, forced to draw his final breath on a dusty New York sidewalk simply because of an air conditioner and the misplaced presence of lost souls. That knife did not just pierce his body, it pierced the absurdity of fate. King Curtis did not die because he did something wrong. He died because he was at his own home at the wrong time, facing a reality of American society rife with violence and the addiction gnawing at the streets. This death carries a tragic and somewhat absurd hue in the way fate arranged it. It reminds us that fame or exceptional talent cannot create a shield to protect a human being from the petty yet highly lethal collisions of everyday life. We still hear his horn in respect as a symbol of power and dignity, yet his own end lacked that very solemnity. He fell beside the appliance he had just bought, amidst the stifling heat of the city, leaving an unfillable void in the hearts of his fans. 10. Daryl Banks, the gunshot of justice and the eternal silence of a lost romantic. In the chronicles of soul music, Daryl Banks was like a sudden thunderstorm, powerful, full of promise, yet vanishing the moment it began to shine. With the hit, "Open the Door to Your Heart," he kicked wide the doors of fame, expected by critics to become the next Otis Redding. But then, the ghost of jealousy and an uneven confrontation on the streets of Detroit in February 1970 slammed the door of his life shut. Daryl Banks's departure stemmed from a fiery tragedy of emotion, where the lines between love, possession, and the barrel of justice were blurred under the biting cold of the city. It all began with the shards of a rotten romance. Instead of standing under the bright stage lights, Daryl appeared on the gray, snow-covered sidewalk to find his ex-lover. But fate had planted a deadly knot right in his path. The man blocking his way was not the lover he expected to meet, but a gun hiding beneath plain clothes. Aaron Bullock, the girl's new lover, was not merely a romantic rival. He was an off-duty police officer. In the fury of a man rejected, Daryl stepped into the most foolish gamble of his life. He thought he was facing a love rival to settle things with fists. But in reality, he was charging into the gun barrel of the entire legal system concealed in street clothes. It was no longer a confrontation between two men. It was the moment a lovesick artist committed nominal suicide by touching the red line of state power. A power that holds no concept of mercy for those who let emotion override reason. The knot was untied as swiftly and ruthlessly as the Detroit snow freezes the ground. Amidst the chaotic three-way brawl, when the ego of a star overshadowed reason, Bullock drew his weapon. No warning, no mercy for one of the most promising voices of the time. The shot tore through the cold mist, embedding itself straight into Daryl's chest, sending him into the void right at the spot where he had only intended to vent his anger. The cruelest tragedy only truly revealed itself when the gunfire fell silent and the legal gears began to turn. While Daryl's body still lay cold on the Detroit pavement, the judicial machine cleared the scene with a soulless stamp: justifiable homicide. On the dry police reports, the plainclothes officer won, but for the music world, it was a massacre of talent with no chance for appeal. The law may find logic in pulling the trigger, but there is no logic that can compensate for the eternal silence of a voice of historical stature. Cruelly for Daryl Banks, he went there trying to pry open the slammed door of an old lover's heart. But in the end, he unwittingly walked straight through the door of death. Daryl's greatest mistake was not love, but the illusion of a star's power when standing before the gun barrel of reality. He entered an emotional dispute with the fiery instinct of an artist, only to be crushed by the ironclad rules of a system that has no room for blind passion.
My dear friends, the death of Daryl Banks is a painfully off-key note in the symphony of soul music, reminding us that fame,
no matter how brilliant, cannot protect a man from the blinding storms of the heart.
11. Lee Morgan. A symphony of blood in a blizzard, and the finishing shot from a savior. On the night of February 19, 1972, the air inside Slug's Saloon in New York was thick with cigarette smoke and the warmth of mesmerizing jazz. Lee Morgan, the illustrious trumpet prodigy, stood on stage at the age of 33, the prime of a genius who had just stepped out of the shadows of drug addiction. But behind those stage lights, a tragedy was smoldering. During a break, a fiery argument erupted between Lee and Helen Morgan, the woman who had walked with him through his darkest days. When Lee ordered her to leave the club, Helen stumbled out, only to return minutes later with a revolver in hand. Amidst the noise of laughter and chatter, Helen walked straight toward the stage, looking at the man she once loved with eyes burning with hatred. "You think you can live without me, Lee?" Her voice trembled, but was filled with resolve before she pulled the trigger. The bullet buried itself straight into Morgan's chest, striking him down right where he had just been shining. The tragedy of that fateful night lay not in the shot that killed him instantly, but in the slow, agonizing sequence that followed. As Morgan fell onto the cold wooden floor, blood began to spill from the chest wound, soaking his performance shirt. Outside the window, a ferocious blizzard was ravaging New York, turning every street into a white maze and completely paralyzing traffic. Inside the chaotic bar, Lee looked at his wife with bewildered eyes, his voice raspy through broken breaths. "Helen, why?" Helen stood there, the gun falling from her hand. She collapsed beside the man she had just shot, suddenly realizing her own madness. She held him, trying to staunch the blood that wouldn't stop flowing, mumbling in belated regret. "Don't go, Lee. Please don't leave me." For over an hour that followed, death arrived with a cruelty that was excruciatingly slow. Those in the bar frantically called for help, but the Reaper had locked down every route with the blizzard. The ambulance, though sirens wailed in desperation, was stuck fast in snowdrifts just a few miles away. Morgan did not die simply because a bullet pierced his heart. He lay there, fully conscious, feeling the cold of death creeping from his feet up to his chest. He watched his own blood mix with the dirt on the floorboards, feeling the warmth of the wife holding him tight, the person who was his only savior, and now, the one ending his life. This is the absurd irony. The woman who once pawned her coat to buy him a trumpet when he was destitute from addiction was now the one using a gun to steal his final breath. The final image of Lee Morgan is a terrifying silence, replacing the brilliant notes of jazz. Behind windows covered in white snow, a musical genius drew his last breath in the arms of the murderer who bore the title of his wife. He died not because of an incurable wound, but because of the stupid delay of a snowstorm, bleeding out on the floor of a dive bar while modern medicine was only a few minutes' walk away. The legendary trumpet was silenced forever, leaving only the howling wind of a New York winter as a tragic eulogy for a life saved and then destroyed by the very same hand. 12. Rudy Lewis, death by a full meal in a lonely hotel and a glory party. Missing one guest. On the night of May 20th, 1964, in a cramped hotel room in New York, Rudy Lewis, the lead singer with the mesmerizing voice of the Drifters, lay alone on a white bed. At 27, Rudy's career was at its most brilliant, yet death came to him in a script that was banal and full of irony. After an overly heavy dinner, the artist's body could not withstand the cruel combination of asphyxiation and a drug overdose. No stage lights, no applause. Rudy departed in absolute silence, dying for a reason so practical it borders on the ridiculous, right on his solitary bed. The next morning, the New York sun crept through the skyscrapers, waking the city for the most important day for the Drifters, but it could not wake Rudy. In the studio, the microphone was ready, the tape was rolling, but the center spot remained a void. It is hard to accept a reality both tragic and silly to this degree. One of the sole voices of a generation was defeated not by a horrific accident or a shocking conspiracy, but by the excess of a dinner. While his body lay lonely within 4 cold hotel walls back at the studio, his colleagues had to swallow their tears to record "Under the Boardwalk." Their singing rang out, echoing through soulless equipment, trying to fill the empty space of a man who had died just because of a mundane physiological slip-up the night before his most glorious moment. The grim irony of this story lies in the destiny of that recording. The song "Under the Boardwalk," recorded on the very morning Rudy Lewis died, quickly became an immortal hit, dominating every chart and becoming a symbol of American music. The world fell in love with that melody without knowing that the group's greatest glory was built upon the very void Rudy left behind. He departed on the very eve of touching immortality, leaving behind a legendary track where his absence is the dull ache throbbing behind the happy notes. The final picture of Rudy Lewis is a cruel contrast between two worlds. On one side is a dark hotel room where a genius lies dead because of a heavy meal and foolish personal mistakes. On the other is a brightly lit studio where his colleagues wipe away tears to sing about fake joys. Rudy died tragically and absurdly, leaving a massive legacy he never got to hear, turning himself into the most famous absentee in the history of jazz and soul. 13. Jesse Belvin, slashed tires and the shattered end of an ambassador of racial harmony. On the night of February 6, 1960, in the state of Arkansas, Jesse Belvin, known as the talented bridge builder, connecting the worlds of R&B and pop, stepped into a 1959 Cadillac with a mood both exhilarated and heavy. He had just completed a historic performance, the first integrated concert held in Little Rock, where white and black audiences sat side by side to enjoy music together. However, in the context of the American South, rife with racial hatred at the time, Belvin's humane act unintentionally made him a thorn in the eyes of extremists. Death threats rang out from the wings, but Belvin chose to smile and leave in the darkness, heading toward his next show. Tragedy struck just hours later on the Hope Highway. The luxurious Cadillac suddenly lost control, slamming head-on into an oncoming vehicle in a horrific collision. The steel frame of the 1959 car was crushed to the point of twisted deformity, burying Belvin and his wife in a wreck of blood and metal. At the scene, people found deep, deliberate slashes on the tires, raising suspicions of an assassination staged by extreme racists. However, official investigation reports introduced confusing details. The driver for Belvin was exhausted after days of continuous travel, and the stretch of road where the accident occurred was a notorious black spot with limited visibility. Technical factors and human fatigue became the perfect smokescreen, making it incredibly difficult to prove in a court of law that this was a political murder. Even so, when placed against the backdrop of an American society reeking of gunpowder and prejudice, the arguments for an accidental crash become incredibly weak. The suffocating irony is that Jesse Belvin spent his life healing racial divides through music, yet his faith in that harmony led him to his grave. He did not die from a simple road risk. He died because he dared to challenge a toxic system of hatred. If those slashes on the tires were real, then this was a cowardly execution. And if it was just a coincidence, then fate played a joke far too cruel on the life of a messenger of peace.
Ladies and gentlemen, did Jesse's car truly spin out of orbit because of a tired driver? Or was it the hand of an underground
Extremist force that silently severed his lifeline the moment he sang to erase hatred?
We have walked together through the darkest pages of American music history, where brilliant glory and banal death are separated by only an inch. That naked truth brings not only sorrow, but also a spine-chilling reminder of the impermanence of human life, where fame and fortune cannot create a shield to protect us from the harsh collisions of the everyday.
Thank you for accompanying us on this emotional journey. If you found this content meaningful, please don't forget to like, subscribe to the channel,
And hit the notification bell so you won't miss the next stories about the hidden corners of legendary black stars in the entertainment world that have never been revealed.